Welcome on board, viewers. Uh, my name is Shrujodai Ghosh, and I work with SIIT Kanpur. I have been tasked to develop this module for faculty, student, entrepreneurs, who wish to be entrepreneurs, for the fundamental understanding of the incubation world, and what are the essentials that one should keep in mind when you're talking about startup incubator as such. So allow me to quickly share my screen, and we should be able to start. That's about right now. Okay, friends. So, of course, in the journey, we need to first understand what is incubation. Especially looking at the fact that most of you would be faculty or students from research and technology background. And so, of course, this word could be a bit confusing when you put it in terms with the startup world. So, of course, let's look at the literal meaning. So, if you look at the literal meaning, it would turn out to be to grow something in a controlled environment. This should help you lay down the context in which incubation services thrive, and to be really very frank about it, for a startup incubator, this is partially true, only partially true. And we'll, as we go further in this module, we'll get to understand why this is partially true. So, of course, the next is let me take you through the preface as to what this whole module would entail. There are five major sections to it. We start with the lay of the land for startups, which is basically let us all understand the environment and the key thumb rule that defines a particular environment and also defines how the startup is going to grow. Um, this will be followed by objectives of incubation, incubation services. So right after lay of the land, we'll get to understand what are the objectives that the incubation services, ought to strive for. Followed by the revenue model for the incubation services that you have, or possible revenue models that are there. And this has to be followed with strategic positioning. Now, the strategic positioning is a section where we would essentially cover how an incubator can, position themselves in the market. Of course, incubators, just like startups, can actually be from a varied section of spectrum. Some of them can deal with socially relevant startups. Some can deal with technology startups. Some can deal with disruptive startups. There are different positionings, and it's important that we choose one for ourselves, because that's essentially how we're going to lay down the direction for the incubator. Now, we follow that and we kind of end the module with the concept of incubator as an orchestrator. So I hope that you all enjoy the following section of this module. Let's start with the lay of the land. Now, of course, the thumb rule. And the thumb rule in the lay of the land is something that is linked to the economic system that we have. The economic system that we have is that of capitalism. Therefore, what we're essentially trying to say is that for all startups, they need to understand that without capital, without someone coming and putting money in them, an idea is just worth very little. It's it's partially, some of the people can look at it and think it's unfortunate, but that's how the economic system works. And trust me, it isn't that unfortunate at all if you're the consumers or the customers of these startups. So let's proceed further. We need to first, before we embark further, understand, the some of the fundamentals of the startups is also part of the lay of the land. So startups, when we look at them, if we try to understand how startups were some time back and what startups look like now, let's look at them in we plot a graph with sales revenue and time, and then we start to look at uh, something that used to happen maybe prior to the 90s or the 2000s. So a startup would start, and then they'd set up a plant, they'd start to sell, and then start to grow the brand. And over a period of time, they would see some growth, which would probably table until unless they do something else. And they get into a brand or they develop a new product. However, but this particular growth pattern is called organic growth. Very important for us to understand, because all startups are not organic meant for organic growth, and there are some startups that are exclusively meant for organic growth. um, and now let's proceed towards the next kind of startup, which is the second kind. This ladies and gentlemen, is a startup that is on an exponential growth curve. So we need to understand the clear difference between these two patterns, because let's look at it this way. If there is a startup that is, let's say working on an IT tool, something that is an app, or something that has, very little investment required in terms of, um, you know, uh, creating a particular product or creating services, and then we set it out in the market. In today's time, this is especially true after the 2000s. There are specific startups that would only grow in an exponential environment, or else they will not. These startups essentially will be very low on capital expenditure, capex or capital expenditure, which is basically the amount of money that one spends in order to start a business, which means you're especially in assets. So if you're setting up a manufacturing plant, then the manufacturing plant, the working capital, all of that would include or would be rather included in the uh, the the low capex model, which will enable the startup to then focus the rest of the resources in spreading awareness about their products, choosing different distribution setups and distribution networks, and then take it forward on an exponential growth. All the big startups and the good startups, and what really a startup coming to you guys when you're in an incubation center will be looking at is this particular growth pattern, which is the exponential growth. Now, one thing is very important for all of us to understand. A startup that is on an organic growth path, uh, vis-a-vis a startup that is on an exponential growth path, will have separate approach and a separate set of strategies for growth. Strategies that are exclusively for this pattern will not work in exponential, and vice versa. That is, if you're taking something that is suitable for organic growth and you're trying to apply that to a startup that is on an exponential growth pattern, it's a sure recipe for disaster for the startup. And of course, because you're the incubator, so therefore for you as well. Now, let us go a little bit deeper in this. So, of course, we looked at the two types of startups, one on those who are meant to be on the organic growth path, and the other ones on the exponential. Now, let's get back to the startup and the lay of the land, how it looks like right now. So we're trying to capture the incubation value chain here in front of you. So we see the startup and we have the industry. And if you see, the whole thing starts up at the incubation center. And so the incubation center, we first screen a startup, then bring them in, then of course we help them with mentors, those who could mentor them on the development part, as well as those who could mentor them on the business part. And then, of course, it all results in services and products that are then taken to the industry. And of course, like I said, the thumb rule, which is that the there's capital, which is essential for any business to start to grow. So therefore, we of course usher in the first rounds of investments. This could be from an angel investor. This could be from various grants. There are multiple options that are open. And then all of this then will start to gear for the time the rubber touches the road. That means when you hit your market. And of course, so what you first get is called traction. Traction in a number of terms could mean something that essentially gives you an indication that the products or services that a startup essentially has uh, looks reasonably sustainable and reasonably appealing to the market, therefore suggesting a good product market fit. And of course, when you have a good traction and you're able to articulate it appropriately, you then get to the next round of investments. And of course, this is a round of investments that are usually heralded by venture capitalists. In Indian scenario, venture capitalists may, get in at a level when the value of the business could be um, estimated to be north of maybe 80 to 100 crores, right? And then, of course, when this happens, it's when technically this, the incubation period gets over, and the incubator gets to get an exit. Of course, what it means is that, of course, when you start incubating a startup, you do have the option of taking stakes or equity that the startup must share with you in order to help you get a sizable return at the exit, and therefore empower you as an incubator to bring on more resources to help more startups. And that's how this whole value chain keeps working. We will get back to this value chain a bit later to understand the whole ecosystem that surrounds the incubation startups. So the next thing that we're going to look at is, of course, the objectives of incubation. Of course, to ensure successful incubation, there are certain stages that have to be looked at, and it's all these stages, have to be successful. They have to have successful outcomes for the incubation to be successful. So starting it with, so that we could look at a two-dimensional view of the growth of any startup that walks in. So therefore, on one axis, we take the company value. On the other one, we take time. And the first stage, of course, so there is a screening here involved, but usually while screening, or in a sort of a pre-incubation kind of an environment, there is ideation stage, that we essentially help startups and entrepreneurs to work on the ideas themselves. And of course, this is after they have been screened, and there is a seed support that the incubator can provide at this stage alongside incubation and ideation support. So the seed support essentially is for the startups to set up a company, pay for the ROC, and then pay for if there are things that they need to understand, information they need to have to have a comprehensive idea. This is a stage that they primarily work upon those issues. Of course, so when we've been able to give this to the startups, and when they have successfully screened into your incubator and the seed support's been provided, and they've been able to work successfully on developing a good idea, then there is a value enhancement. Now, this is important for us to understand, because this is not a currency. These are startups, and therefore, what value the startups hold is going to be something that's going to be extremely relative to the market and to a variety of variables, actually. depending on competition, depending on the customer segment. I mean, it's just, that it is something that's kind of complicated, but we try to simplify this as we go on in this module for you all. Of course, this is followed by developing a value hypothesis. So what we mean by value hypothesis is that, whatever value you're going to generate, the value is going to stem out from a challenge that you're helping, your customers take care. I mean, challenges that you're taking care of for your customers. Now that's the value that you are giving to the customer. But initially, before you started the sales cycles, it is all a hypothesis. You already understand that you are making something that's going to be valuable for the people that you're going to sell it to is a hypothesis to start with. Unless you take it and you go over to people, those who represent the actual customer segments, your actual customers, and you talk to them and you understand what they have to say. Do they really look at it as value or not? So this is a stage that we call, which is, you can look at it as rather the second stage. And this is a stage where we give you validation guidance. I mean, where we need to give validation guidance to, to entrepreneurs. So of course, it's the value hypothesis, and the value hypothesis needs to be validated. And of course, once you've done those validations, we get to a bit higher level of value, and that is an increment. And it is, of course, the end of this stage. And of course, this stage is then followed up with prototype. So what do you mean by prototype is once you've figured out that, okay, what value you're going to give, then of course that value has to be in a certain mode. It has to be in a certain form that we usually call products or services. Now, the third stage is the prototyping stage. Now, this is a stage where you also provide a prototyping support. That could be also in terms of resources. It could be in terms of lab infrastructure for some of the institutions that you may be working for in their incubation services. Institutions will have to partner with a large section of other institutions if they do not have appropriate amount of lab infrastructure available. So this is how an incubator has to essentially provide means and access to lab infrastructure as well as resources required for the prototyping. And this is called the prototyping stage and the prototyping support. And of course, this too results in enhancement of value for that particular startup. Now, when we follow this up with the next stage, which we call the proof of concept, or the POC, which is an acronym that you'd find used multiple times in the startup world. So what is a POC is typically where you have proof of concept for your idea, that the idea is working and that people are willing to pay for it. And therefore, as an incubator, you would always try to get them paid POC, which means that they're deploying the solution, but they're also getting paid for it. It's not that they're having to do that free of cost. So a lot of startups that you will probably come across are startups that are either having products that could be for businesses. So these are customers who would require a significant amount of deployment of resources to be able to receive their the products and services from a particular startup. And that's a costly affair. And of course, the incubator should have an environment or have relationships with the market so as to provide for paid POC, which means that the startups are getting paid for the work that they're doing, which is, of course, a further endorsement to investors, because that's when the investors get a good idea of how the startup is most likely going to develop in future and how sustainable it looks like. This, of course, is then followed by one of the most important stages, which is called the market connect. And of course, this is also a stage that we call, that the incubators provide go-to-market support for. This is, a stage where a lot of brainstorming has to happen, a lot of mentorship, mentor engagement has to happen, a lot of customer engagement has to happen. What we're essentially trying to do, if you remember, some slides back, we talked about these two different startups, the ones on exponential growth. So of course, this is the stage where you lay down the strategy that is going to help you grow exponentially. That means you should look at, or you should be able to see your customers growing from, let's say, 5 customers on day one to maybe 15 on day two to maybe 55 on day three. And that's the exponential growth pattern. You should be able to foresee that. If you're opening up a single shop on retail and you're putting up your product there, you're not going to have exponential growth at all. You're going to have a very gradual growth, or it could be a little fast growth to start with, but then again, it'll become organic in nature. For exponential, that's different, and that's why the incubators come in, and that's why all this engagement comes in. And this is also something that requires validation. So just like your value hypothesis, your go-to strategy is your growth hypothesis. Therefore, it needs validation as well. And of course, once we're done with all of that, that is when we get a lot of funding. And the funding would essentially then put your company value on the exponential growth path. Now, if you see, in in a holistic approach, you're only going to be successful when you are successful in, you're getting successful outcomes in all of these 6 stages. So you should be mindful about all these 6 stages, and what all in each of these stages, what all we look for. And of course, that is not a part of the beginner module, but that can come later. Now we follow this up. The next stage that we move on to is the incubation value chain once again. All right, so why do we have it? Because we need to understand that when we were talking about all these stages of growth, in all of these stages, apart from the startup and the value chain that we saw a couple of slides earlier, there are a number of other plans. They are quintessential for the startup to work with, to be successful and sustainable. Now, if you see, of course, no brainer, regulatory and compliances. Let's say you have a drug company. The drug company needs to undergo clinical trials. Let's say you have a company which is in bioplastic. Now, of course, the bioplastic, you cannot go out and sell bioplastic unless you have a certification from a competent authority. For you, it's also important that there are regulatory compliances that you have to follow, because because of a startup. These are rules that the compliances that the startups need to you know keep in mind and keep checking those boxes. And you as an incubator are also responsible for it, as long as the startup is there inside your incubation services. Of course, then we have the fundraising. So of course, we need to look at various other angel investors groups. For instance, you have the Indian Angel Network, IAN. You have similar other impact investors, usually those who would come in at a stage where the risk is high. And for all of this, the incubator and the brand promise of that incubator is very important for, and it takes a long time to build. Because the angel investors, the strategic investors, the impact investors at this stage need to have a certain comfort. They need to know and relate your services to be of a certain standard. And that's how this is an important aspect of the overall ecosystem. Then, of course, followed by there are other players. For instance, you have a legal. So you need to give legal support. Now, we can expect startups that have engineers in them, that have management people in them. But of course, very few startups, unless, of course, from that domain, will have legal. So, of course, in startups, you do not have the comfort of, having a lot of people on your team, and therefore legal is one such aspect where third parties are available, and then you can be connected by those third parties, and so you pay on a piecemeal basis. Now, when we follow this, of course, then we get into industrial designing. Now, if you have, for instance, if you have, let's say, a hardware uh, product, that product has to be industrially made. That means there is volumes involved in it. And for every industrial product, there has to be an industrial design, which means every aspect, the material used in that product, what kind of material is it? Does it satisfy the requirements of that product? In terms of temperature, in terms of texture, in terms of features. Um, they can, are those, is that component industrially available? Is there a supply chain that's already in place? And looking at those aspects, and then of course the design optimization. So how do you ensure that the amount of resources that you're putting uh, towards building one particular product, how would you ensure they are optimized? So you're not using any extra material that's unnecessarily increasing the weight. It's basically not a value addition to the overall product at all. Similar can be looked at in terms of products that are software or IT based. You know, in that place, of course, the industrial designing will change into something like user experience and the user interface design. But essentially, these are aspects that, of course, third parties or there are players who are known for this, and of course, they need to be then brought into the mix for the startup. Now, of course, there are several other startup services as well. For instance, when you start, when you're starting up, you may not want to go ahead with overheads for maybe something like, let's say, finance, or something like, let's say, HR, human resource management. And of course, so all of them can be bundled under what we call startup services, and can be provided as third party, services on a piecemeal basis. Uh, so followed by industrial partners and OEMs. Of course, now if you have a startup that is in hardware business, of course, they will not be able to get into anything without having uh, somebody make those for them. Hardware has got to be manufactured, and of course, startups usually do not have the. And if you remember, the organic path vis-a-vis the exponential growth path. The exponential growth path is essentially a capex loan, model, which means that initial investments, that is in terms of, let's say, the plant, the machinery, the people, the processes. For you to set up all of that, you need a lot of investment, and of course, so this is a stage where there are individual manufacturers out there who essentially can be then brought in the mix, and they can do the manufacturing for the startup. So of course, this is a very essential part of, let's say, any hardware solution that we're looking at. Followed by CSR. Of course, we all know that corporate social responsibility has now come up in a big manner, and CSRs support startups through incubators. So that's one of the essential, uh, you know, uh, industry player. Followed by, of course, the social media management. Of course, social media management in today's world, especially for startups that are looking at the exponential growth, is nothing short of an essential and a very critical input. Unfortunately, once again, it is very less likely that the entrepreneurs or the startups themselves will have somebody who will be on top of the social media management game. And a lot of us, we feel we understand social media. However, if you really go to an in-depth analysis, you will understand that this is an extremely vibrant segment where a lot of it's extremely dynamic. So a lot of things keep changing, and the trends, they can change almost, you know, snap of a finger overnight. And unless you have somebody who is from the industry, you tend to lose out on it. And therefore, this too needs to be then brought into the mix as a third party. So what we discussed in this overall um, slide and section is basically, what does the startup ecosystem look like? It's not, the startup and the incubator are not the only two players in this ecosystem, as you can see very clearly. And if you see, the incubation center is the link between all of this, and that's by design. That's what we are there for. Now, moving on to, yes, the revenue sources. Now, of course, we too, incubators too, are subject to economic requirements and economic inputs. Therefore, we need to have revenue. Now, in this slide, we're going to look and very quickly move over the various means that are available to an incubator, from where they can derive the much needed nutrition, which is the revenue, of course. And so let's look at that. All right, then. So let's look at each one of them, starting from the leftmost. And of course, there is going to be lab and institutional. There are institutional stuff that you would give to a startup for use. Um, so for all of such uses, you will be able to get a certain amount of revenue. Of course, this is a segment that that needs to be subsidized, or it needs to be in a manner that allows the startups a lot of slack, because right at the beginning, even if you get a grant, you really don't have too much money to spend. So of course, this is one aspect which is a source of revenue. However, it's not a very large source of revenue. Followed by co-working space and assets. Of course, now this is another avenue from where there could be significant amount of significant amount of earnings that can come from the incubator, provided you are giving the startup space to work. And if you're giving them assets like computer desktop, like printers, fax machines, if you were photocopiers, if you're giving all of these, then all of these can be put on rent, and the rent, of course, is the revenue source fee. Now, of course, the incubators also uh, can look at creating events, and some of those events can be chargeable, and of course, uh, you do essentially get into these because a little later we'll see in this module why. But events essentially allow you to engage with the ecosystem that we just looked at the last slide. And if we can figure out ways of, let's say, getting sponsorships, getting CSR funds in the form of for these events, of course, they then become naturally a source of revenue for you. Then followed by, of course, the management fee from grants. Of course, the grants. So if you are a government institution or a private institution that happens to be looked at as an incubation center under some kind of a scheme, that could be a government or a private scheme, then they do certainly give you certain amount of money, which goes to you as a management fee. So which means that the management fee is something that is a sheer addition to your top line. the grants aren't. The grants would then, of course, flow over to the startups that actually win those grants. Now, just like events, we also get the opportunity to organize workshops. And workshops could be various. So, for instance, to share an example with you all, there are a lot of workshops that are held today where people, pay to attend them. Essentially, these workshops can include, something like, for corporates, they really want to understand how the startups are able to develop products much, much, much faster than what the corporates otherwise do. And therefore, the workshops could be conducted to give them a flavor of that. And of course, the corporates will not mind paying for it. And therefore, here comes your opportunity to not only engage corporates who could become your prospective um, customers for your startups, but also to earn from them, in the form of workshops. And then the next one, of course, is training and development. So, of course, we can look at training and development as they may not necessarily be looked upon as something traditional. It could be small modules, it could be skills, it could be various things. It could be, for instance, AI, something on AI, artificial intelligence. And so we can, of course, create these various training and development programs that we can create because we're working with those startups and we understand that very well. And of course, sell that in the market and, of course, earn a revenue from that. So that is training and development. Now, of course, the biggest of this is the amount of revenue that you can get from from equity sales, from an exit that you get, or from revenue sharing that you may want to get into a contract with the startup stating that you would, for a certain period of time, take a bit of their revenues and therefore link yourself with that. You may want to choose both. So some startups, may be willing to part with equity as well as revenue sharing, and all of that. It's basically terms that you could actually work upon, and you come up with whatever combination that suits you. But essentially, that is the biggest pie, the biggest source of revenue for any incubator. There's nothing bigger than this. Now, time has come to move to the next uh, one of the most interesting um, slides, parts or sections of this module, and that is called strategic positioning. And before we start on this, let's take a small break and we'll get back later. All right, friends, I'm back, and let's resume from where we had left. Okay, then. So when we look at strategic positioning, I've put a caption there which says, if we don't know what to look for, we cannot find our way to it, right? That's true, isn't it? Okay, so in order to look at the positioning, I'm going to use the BCG, or the Boston Consultancy Group metric, or the 9 blocker. And I'm going to look at 2 dimensions, both on X and Y axes, and they being technology complexity. That means that what is the amount of complexity involved in developing the technology or the innovation that we're talking about? And on the other hand, we'll have impact potential. Now, this is social impact potential. If you're trying to look at sustainable models, and therefore the social impact potential is what we look at on the x-axis. And of course, when we build these axes, unfortunately, it's very difficult to put them alongside numbers. Therefore, we are looking at a low, medium, high, on both these axes to quantify what we're trying to say. So, of course, if we now superimpose the different various segments, now these segments are going to be, I mean, you could look at them as hardware, software, ICT, medical devices, social impact. There are different kinds of, categories that we could come up with, and each one will represent a particular segment. And these segments, you can, depending on what is required for them, you can easily put them in this 9 blocker. So if you see, technically this becomes 9 blocks because you have a high low, and then a high medium, and then a high high. And similarly, there are 9 blocks out here, as you can see, if I were to create grid lines. Now, in these 9 blocks, you can take a call as to, which kind of a segment do you want to specialize, because you see, you cannot specialize in all of them, uh, especially because of access to, the kind of lab infrastructure that is required, to support a particular startup in any of these segments. So of course you cannot go for all. Therefore, you'll have to be very careful and choose the segments that are really making sense for you. So I can give you an example. If there is an institution that has significant amount of diversity in the lab infrastructure, in the resources, the knowledge base that it provides with, then it can look at a segment that would, that could be something ranging between high complexity, medium impact, to high complexity, high impact, and otherwise medium impact to high medium complexity, high impact. So this one, these 3 blocks that we see here, this will be one, this is the second one, this will be the third one, would then clearly, help you understand that how should you position your incubator. What is the promise that you're making, and who are you making that promise to, and what is required in order to help those, or successfully deliver on the incubation. So this is, I hope that you're all able to relate with the caption. Again, if we don't know what to look for, we cannot find our way to it. So this is essentially a particular tactical step that you ought to take before, the incubator can be laid down, or the various processes, protocols, the material that you're going to use to create awareness or do outreach for your incubator. All of that has to be in sync, and this is the way you focus, essentially. So if you really want to grow fast and grow high, then the focus is very important, just like a startup, just like for a startup. So this is a tool and a strategy that helps you do that. Of course, there are various ways of looking at it. What I'm showing to you is just one of those ways, and one of the rather simpler ways of deciding things. This whole analysis can be performed with various tools, and we could bring in even the competition that's around into it, and then look at a more multi-dimensional, taking a more multi-dimensional approach. But having said that, this is important, and has to be done for any specific incubator. Now let's proceed to the next step, which is the last step for this, you know, uh, beginners, I should say, beginners module into incubation services, or understanding, what is an incubator. And of course, as the title of this slide suggests, incubator as an orchestrator. So if you see, what does an incubator do? Nothing. If you really see, there is very little that the incubator is doing themselves. All they're trying to do is just connecting the startups to the ecosystem. You see, if you relate to the slides that we went through, where we highlighted the value chain, and then we highlighted the ecosystem that is required to ensure that the value chain thrives upon. It's all uh, various different entities, in some of those cases governments, some of those cases corporates, some of those cases service providers. Essentially, when there is a need, we as an incubator must just know how to connect the dots. And of course, so what it also means is that we need to orchestrate a show. And how orchestrate with whom? Of course, we've discussed this. So we're looking at experts and mentors. That could be very easy for an institution that may be there for a long, long time. So traditionally, they may have access, but it could also be not so. But however, the experts and then mentors, and especially if you remember the last slide where we talked about the positioning is concerned, especially from that aspect, we will need to align, the ecosystem that we then further connect with those segments that we try to target. So of course the experts and mentors, then followed by regulatory, of course. So like I said, regulatory is an essential part before a particular business can go on and start to sell their products and services. Therefore, regulatory becomes a very important part. There are people who are in the regulatory framework who become important. More so, there could be experts about the regulatory framework who could also be very, very important. So it's important that we avoid a situation of doing something that is not regulatory correct, and having to pay a penalty for that, because for the startup, one small mistake could really do a dent on their future. And so, of course, you have to be very, very careful. Therefore, it makes sense to consult before you take, consult the regulatory framework, consult the experts before you take a specific step. And then, of course, there's research and development. So, of course, when you come to research and development, again, depending on the segments that you're trying to target, you will have to come up or link yourself to give a wholesome lab infrastructure and resource availability, kind of a thing for those specific segments yourself. And if you don't have it in premises at your end, then you would like to partner with establishments who have that, so that that could be offered as a standard to those startups who are coming for incubation to your place. Then we have, of course, in product development. If you remember, we talked about the OEMs and the industrial design third parties, as well as the UX developers, the UI developers, all of that, right? And of course, uh, nothing. If you remember the slide where we talked about all the stages of the startup, and we mentioned that in each of these stages, you have to excel, or you have to have a successful outcome for you to be successful in an overall sense, for sense of a startup incubator. So therefore, one of the most important things that you're actually providing is the market connect, which means that if you can take a technology directly to the industry, then there's nothing better than that. So what it essentially also means is that you create awareness about your startups, you create awareness about your brand, you create connects with various industry players in order to directly have your startup sell to these market players. And that's something we call market connect. And so if you really look at it, it's a game of networking, outreach, partnerships, right? Very essential partnerships, And something that you may have heard a lot, something called open innovation. So it means is that these are some of the tools that are put there to help you relate as to what all you need to do, what all activities need to be done in order to do these connections, or in order to have these to be able to connect them to startups. So with this, I believe we are at the end of it. So I really thank you, and I hope that you all enjoyed this module. For any questions, feel free to get back in touch with me. You should be able to find me on the LinkedIn. The name is Sujodhay Ghosh. You could also call me Surya. But thank you so much, and wish all those who are looking forward to getting into the